Lake Okeechobee means big water in the Seminole Native American language, and at 730 square miles, it certainly lives up to its name. But it's also big in controversies, and also one of Florida's greatest ecological treasures.
In December of 2024, the United States Army Corps of Engineers made a decision that sent billions of gallons of water rushing east and west across Florida. They called it recovery operations. What that water carried with it, what rose from the lake bottom, and traveled into rivers, estuaries, and ultimately toward the taps and tables of millions of Floridians, is the story that never fully made the evening news. The footage shot by pilots and advocacy groups over the St. Lucie River and Caloosahatchee showed dark plumes spreading into coastal waters like ink dropped into a glass. People watching those images assumed they were seeing pollution. They were right. What they did not know was that the pollution had been building for nearly a century, and that lowering the lake had not removed it. It had released it. To understand what came out of that lake, you first have to understand what the lake is, because most Americans who can find it on a map still have no real sense of what it represents. Lake Okeechobee is the second largest freshwater lake sitting entirely within the contiguous United States, covering approximately 730 square miles. From the southern shore on a clear morning, the northern bank is invisible. There is nothing in sight but open water and subtropical sky. Yet for all its surface size, the lake is startlingly shallow. Its average depth is roughly 9 feet. In some areas, a person could walk several hundred yards from the shoreline before the water reached their chest. That shallowness defines everything about how the lake behaves. It heats up fast. It mixes easily. It responds to every wind, every storm, and every disturbance with the sensitivity of a shallow pan rather than the stability of a deep reservoir. And when pollutants enter it, they do not disappear. They sink, they settle, and they stay. The Calusa people called it Miami, meaning big water, and for them it was a source of food, fresh water, and shelter. Spanish explorers in the 1600s gave it a more dramatic name, Laguna del Espiritu Santo, the lagoon of the Holy Spirit. When the Seminole moved into Florida in the 18th century, they translated the original meaning into their own language and called it Okeechobee. That name survived everything that followed. Marcellus Osceola Jr., the chairman of the Seminole tribe of Florida, has noted in recent years that his ancestors drank freely from the streams feeding into this lake. Today, he has said, you would not consider doing that. You would not consider swimming in it either. That transformation did not happen suddenly. It accumulated across decades, driven by one of the most consequential engineering and agricultural decisions in American history. But before any of that machinery was built, the lake itself delivered a catastrophe so severe that the federal government had no choice but to intervene. On the night of September 16, 1928, a Category 4 hurricane made landfall near Palm Beach. The storm had already torn through Puerto Rico as a Category 5, killing more than 1,000 people across the Caribbean before reaching Florida. When it pushed inland toward Lake Okeechobee, it found a lake protected only by a small earthen embankment along its southern shore, barely 4 feet high. Behind that embankment lived thousands of agricultural workers, most of them black migrants from the Bahamas, Caribbean, and the American South, who picked beans, sugarcane, and winter vegetables in the rich muck soil of the floodplain. When the hurricane's winds drove the lake water against that embankment, the structure simply gave way. A wall of water swept across the farmland between Belle Glade and Pahokee. Houses were lifted whole off their foundations. The official death toll, as revised by the National Weather Service in 2003, stands at approximately 2,500 people. Many historians believe the real number exceeds 3,000. The majority of the dead were black. What happened after the storm compounded the original tragedy. White victims were collected, identified where possible, placed in coffins, and buried with some measure of dignity. Black victims were not afforded the same. State officials ordered black survivors at gunpoint to gather the bodies of the dead. One man who refused, Coot Simpson, was shot in front of others. Collected bodies were stacked in groups, soaked in fuel oil, and burned in open pits. In West Palm Beach, approximately 674 black bodies were placed without coffins into a shallow trench at the corner of 25th Street and Tamarind Avenue. Through the decades that followed, that ground served as a garbage dump, then a slaughterhouse, then a sewage treatment site. A historical marker was placed there in 2003 on the 75th anniversary of the storm. For the families of the dead, the reckoning arrived 3/4 of a century late. The political response to the hurricane, however, was immediate. The federal government decided the lake would never be allowed to flood again. The Army Corps of Engineers was ordered to build a permanent wall around it. The Herbert Hoover Dike, named for the president who championed it, runs for 143 miles around the entire lake perimeter. Construction began in 1932 and continued in phases through the following decades. After additional hurricanes struck in 1947, the structure was expanded further. By the late 1960s, what had once been a living, breathing freshwater lake connected to the Everglades and the coastal estuaries had been converted into a managed reservoir, its water levels controlled by gates, its flows redirected by canals into patterns determined by engineers and shaped by politics. The wall did exactly what it was built to do. It kept the water in. What no one fully reckoned with was that it also kept everything else in, every drop of runoff, every particle of fertilizer, every contaminant that agriculture sent downstream for the next 100 years. The scale of what accumulated is almost beyond comprehension. In 2020, 3 scientists, Thomas Missimer, Thomas Bliss, and Barry Rosen, published a study in the journal Water that deserved far more attention than it received. Based on sediment cores extracted from across the lake bed, they estimated the bottom of Lake Okeechobee holds approximately 4,600 metric tons of phosphorus. This is not a projection or a model artifact. It is a calculated figure from physical samples. For most of the 20th century, the agricultural operations surrounding the lake, sugarcane fields, dairy farms, cattle ranches, vegetable operations, sent their fertilizer-laden runoff downstream and into the lake. The phosphorus in that runoff does not remain suspended in the water column. It binds to clay particles and sinks, accumulating layer by layer in the lake sediment. Year after year, decade after decade, the load grew heavier and more concentrated. Scientists studying the problem in the early 2000s reached a conclusion that should have triggered emergency action. Even if every external source of phosphorus feeding the lake were eliminated immediately, the legacy load already buried in the muck was sufficient to keep algae blooms growing for as long as 200 years. A separate analysis by Curtis Paulman and Thomas James in 2011 calculated that the lake's water column would still require roughly 40 years to return to safe phosphorus levels, even under the strictest possible pollution controls. Florida's own legal standard allows 140 metric tons of phosphorus to enter the lake per year. The actual 5-year average measured between 2013 and 2017 was 531 metric tons, nearly 4 times the legal limit. The sediment at the bottom is not uniform. Researchers have identified 3 distinct types. The first is dark and consolidated, relatively stable, and does not move easily. The second is loosely packed and brownish in color, easily disturbed by storms and boat traffic. The third is what the Missimer study described as thixotropic mud, dark, dense, almost liquid in its texture, and uniquely dangerous. When disturbed, this layer releases up to 50% more nutrients into the water column than either of the other types. The December 2024 discharge sent water through gates and control structures that ran directly through zones where this material sits. When the Corps explained the event publicly, they acknowledged some sediment movement, but did not emphasize that the sediment most likely to be disturbed was precisely the most nutrient-rich and reactive material in the entire lake. That material entered the St. Lucie River on the Atlantic side and the Caloosahatchee River on the Gulf side, and from there it traveled into coastal estuaries where seagrass beds, oyster populations, and marine fisheries had been struggling for years to recover from previous discharge events. But phosphorus, as serious as it is not the only danger rising from that muck. There is something else, something that has been moving quietly through the food chain for years and showing up in places that most people never expected. The story of how scientists came to understand it begins not in Florida, but on a remote island in the Pacific. In the early 2000s, ethnobotanist Dr. Paul Allen Cox and his colleague Dr. Sandra Bannock were investigating a devastating neurological disease cluster in the village of Humatak on the island of Guam. Roughly 1 in 4 adults in that village were dying from a condition that combined features of Lou Gehrig's disease, Parkinson's disease, and Alzheimer's simultaneously. The National Institutes of Health had been studying the cluster for 2 decades without identifying the cause. Cox and Bannock traced it to a neurotoxin called BMAA, beta-methylaminoalanine, produced by cyanobacteria. The villagers had been eating flying foxes that fed on seeds colonized by those bacteria. The toxin accumulated through the food chain. After years of exposure, it appeared to trigger neurodegeneration. In the summer of 2016, Cox saw television footage of a cyanobacteria bloom so thick that residents of Stuart, Florida, were calling it guacamole. It was flowing down the St. Lucie River following a Lake Okeechobee discharge. He flew to Florida the next day. 11 dead manatees had already been recovered from the affected waters. He sampled the bloom. The results came back positive for the same neurotoxin he had identified in Guam. That finding triggered a new wave of research in Florida. In 2019, a team led by Dr. Christopher Davis tested the brains of 14 dolphins that had stranded in Florida and Massachusetts. 13 of them contained elevated levels of BMAA. Several of those brains also showed protein plaque buildup consistent with a kind of pathology associated with Alzheimer's disease in humans. Dr. Larry Brand at the University of Miami published research showing that pink shrimp from Florida Bay carried elevated concentrations of the same compound. The toxin was not staying in the lake. It was moving through the ecosystem. Then came an event that should have made every homeowner in South Florida sit up straight. On May 28, 2021, the Palm Beach County Department of Health issued a formal advisory. A different cyanotoxin, cylindrospermopsin, had been detected in the finished drinking water supply serving West Palm Beach, and South Palm Beach. The population of the affected service area was approximately 120,000 people. Children, pregnant women, immunocompromised individuals, and pets were advised not to drink tap water. Bottled water was distributed at public parks for several days. What compounded the alarm was a detail buried in the timeline. The contamination had been detected more than a week before residents were notified. The source water for that utility traces through canals connected to a watershed that ultimately includes Lake Okeechobee. The drinking water emergency was not a freak accident. It was the downstream consequence of a system that had been accumulating problems for generations. What that means for the people who live alongside the system is something Lake Erie residents in Toledo learned firsthand in August 2014 when a microcystin bloom driven by agricultural runoff forced the city to cut off drinking water to roughly 500,000 people for 3 days. The shallow, warm, nutrient-saturated conditions that produced that crisis are structurally similar to what exists in Lake Okeechobee. The Chesapeake Bay region, after years of voluntary cleanup efforts that accomplished little, was placed under a binding federal restoration plan in 2010 that all 6 surrounding states were legally required to follow. Florida has accepted no comparable federal enforcement framework for Okeechobee. Eve Samples, director of Friends of the Everglades, noted in April 2026 that without acquiring substantially more land south of the lake, there is no realistic path to reducing the legacy nutrient load to ecologically safe levels within any foreseeable timeline. The Herbert Hoover Dike was built to stop the water from killing people. It succeeded at that purpose. What it also did, unintentionally but unavoidably, was seal a century of agricultural pollution inside a wall from which there is no clean exit. Every storm that overfills the lake forces a choice with no good answer. Every discharge disturbs the muck. Every disturbance releases what has been accumulating since before most living Floridians were born. Florida did not preserve a lake. Florida built a vault. The footage from December 2020 showed what happens when you open it. And Colonel Bowman's 5-year estimate means the next opening is already on the clock.